It's great to see so many of you here. We're delighted that you're able to make it along this morning. 1 week from Saturday, the Constitutional Convention, set up to review elements of the Irish Constitution, will meet for the first time. 4 days later, we'll see the 6th successive austerity budget here in Ireland. The former has been given no mandate to examine socio-economic rights, despite every political party being on the record on the need to examine the potential constitutional incorporation of these rights. And the latter, the budget, will impact upon people's access to healthcare, to their right to an adequate standard of living, to their right to education. Only last year, the government committed in the programme for government to, quote, require all public bodies to take due note of equality and human rights in carrying out their functions. So what role has this requirement played in the deliberations and decisions of the Department of Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform in preparing for the budget? Ireland, as we all know, became party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1989. Yet I think it's fair to say that government does not know how or does not see the rationale for using human rights to frame policy and financial decisions, or how to embed human rights protection domestically. But there are answers to those issues and problems. International and national speakers will today examine the context for human rights protection and how Irish laws, both constitutional and statutory, policy and financial decision making can be used to protect human rights. We're going to hear from Iain and Ignacio this morning about why human rights and economic discourses must not exist in separate vacuums, how human rights are impacted upon by economic policy, and how human rights must be used to frame the solutions to the current economic crisis. This morning's breakout sessions will consider how we use law to set standards outlining the responsibility of the state and to frame government policy, what constitutional protection exists in Ireland and how states with stronger provisions use these provisions or are using these provisions to engage with the austerity debate. Duncan Wilson and Rory O'Connell will speak to how Ireland could fulfil that requirement to take due note of human rights and equality by mainstreaming human rights across government policy and establishing systems to monitor government's budgetary systems, resource allocation and expenditure to measure the extent to which they are meeting their human rights obligations. This afternoon, we'll then look at the potential for engagement with international mechanisms, how those international mechanisms develop standards for human rights protection, and how civil society can engage with them to hold government to account. Ireland this year signed the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Iain will return later on to speak to the potential this offers for access to justice for those whose ESC rights have been denied. But of course, it's not all about law, government policy and international protection mechanisms. What about us? What about our elected representatives? What are the public perceptions of human rights? Well, polling that we've done over the last year shows very high levels of support for ESC rights in Ireland and for their constitutional protection. It also shows very significant levels of understanding of ESC rights. That, for instance, the right to health is an essential human right. I think it's about 85% of people that we polled last year viewed the right to health as fundamental and important a human right as the right to fair trial. But what's clear is that most Irish people don't necessarily understand that those rights are not provided for in law and therefore aren't protected. It's only when they come up against a difficulty in their own experience that they realise that protections don't exist. Yet, so there is that level of understanding, but people don't connect them with the crisis they're experiencing, including the current economic crisis. Are we operating on a level playing field? Would human rights disrupt the balance of power and place it back in the hands of the people government is elected to serve? How do we then campaign for the change that we seek? So there's a lot then in that regard for discussion in another one of our afternoon panels. Ireland is in the midst of a crisis, an economic and political crisis, and indeed a social crisis. But there's very little debate about how we engage with that crisis in terms of the protection of rights. Much public and political debate is on our obligations to institutions, the ECB, the IMF, the markets, bondholders. But what about the obligations to the people of Ireland? Imagine if ESC rights had been written into our constitution. What would that have meant for the negotiation a number of years ago of the austerity package, of the deal with the IMF and the ECB? Imagine a situation where an Irish government entering such negotiations was able to say, yes, absolutely, we want to honour the obligations that we have to the markets, to bondholders, to the ECB, to the IMF, but we also have to honour our own constitutional obligations to people here in Ireland around issues like health, the right to education, the right to housing, minimum income standards, etc. Those are valuable obligations in that regard for a state that's entering into those kinds of negotiations. It is time that we had a debate in Ireland about the protection of ESC rights, and not an abstract one about the nature of constitutional protection, but about how these rights, to which Ireland has voluntarily committed itself, are used to guide the decisions and delivery of services by government, to make hard decisions and to offer protection to the people of Ireland. This debate, of course, needs to be had as part of the Constitutional Convention. It needs to be had in the Oireachtas. It needs to be had around the Cabinet table, but it also needs to be had around the kitchen table. It's a debate that we all have to play a part in pursuing. It needs to feed into the answers that government and the public are looking for in how we address the crisis and how we chart our way forward.